Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the call today. We're going to give it one more minute before we start the presentation, just so that everyone has an opportunity to join the call. So 1 or 2 minutes, and I'll get rolling on the presentation. All right, good morning. I am going to get things rolling today. My name is Georgia Vince, and I'm with Tetra Tech, and we are the consulting team that is supporting Palm Beach County on the multi-jurisdictional flooding and sea level rise risk assessment. Thank you for joining the call today. We'll start off reviewing the project objectives for those of you who have not been on a call with us before. We'll talk about the exposure analysis and the sensitivity analysis that's going to be part of the vulnerability assessment report. And then we'll follow up with next steps and questions at the end. It's kind of a speed round today. We have multiple communities today, and we're going to start off with Cloud Lake, following the meeting agenda and switching every 15 minutes. So if you're interested in a particular community, feel free to stick around and hopefully you'll find today's presentation really informative. I will start with reviewing our project objectives. We really want to develop a cohesive strategy to identify vulnerabilities associated with current and future flood risk. So we're assessing flood hazards and looking to comply with state legislature, which Erin's going to be talking about in a few minutes. This report that we're preparing will hopefully guide future needs for the community and identify partnerships between the local governments, the county, and the state, with the end goal being to increase eligibility for state and federal grant funding. I'm going to turn it over to Erin now to talk about the Resilient Florida statutes.
Sure. Thanks, Georgia. So in 2021, the state of Florida passed legislation that allows local governments to access funds to conduct vulnerability assessments. A vulnerability assessment is an evaluation that collects information from the local government about the things that are important to the functionality of the community. Those are known as assets, services, buildings, roads, that type of thing. And I'll describe what the statute says those actually are in a slide or two. But you have to identify what those assets are and then determine what the risk is to those assets from current and future flooding. The statute requires us to look at the 2050 and 2080 timeframes, and we also look at scenarios that are a little bit further out than that. And it requires us to prioritize what assets are going to be impacted when by what type of flooding, because we know that we see different types of flooding across the county. Along the coast, we see things that are impacted by sea level rise and tidal flooding, but further inland, it's more rainfall driven flooding. So we look at those different scenarios. We identify what we call like high priority focus areas or hotspots where we have certain types of flood risk and a conglomeration of assets simultaneously. So we know that that area is something that is important to protect from future climate impacts. And we are now presenting midway the results and where we're heading with the study to the public to get feedback. Next slide. So, when the state of Florida provides money to local governments to conduct these vulnerability assessments, they want to make sure that the feedback that they're getting from all of the local governments is consistent. Because the state is using data also from these studies to prioritize its strategies, its projects, and where its investments will be to help communities adapt to climate risk from flooding. So we have to use certain elevation data. That is the North American Vertical Datum of 1988, which means that, everybody that's providing elevation information back to the state, they're doing it in the same datum so that the state can actually do something with that information. We have to model at least 2 sea level rise scenarios, and that is the 2022 National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And when we plan for climate science, we plan for the fact that there may be a certain level of uncertainty. So we plan for a range of conditions, including low and intermediate sea level rise projections. The final thing is we all have to use consistent planning timeframes, the 2050 and the 2080 scenarios. So this is what we've done with our analysis so far. The graphic here is kind of showing the different types of flood risk and how it impacts and communities. And here it's just a building structure. But what you can see is when you have multiple types of climate impacts at the same time, they exacerbate one another, and those impacts become more pronounced. Next slide. So the statute defines the types of assets that we have to look at, but it also gives the community some level of flexibility to define what it thinks the most critical assets are. So the statute gives like a range of examples of the types of things that you would evaluate for transportation, roads, bridges, rail, marinas. It could also mean mobility, stops, bus stops. It could be a couple of different types of transportation related assets. So this is the range of the information that we collect on those assets, and we put it into a database so we know where all of those assets are. Critical infrastructure is going to be your water, your wastewater, your stormwater, those utility-based assets. And that's within the critical infrastructure kind of realm. Critical community and emergency facilities are important, but they may be things that aren't owned and maintained by a local government, for instance, a hospital or a clinic or something like that. But the community depends on those facilities, so you want to know where they're at and how they're going to be impacted by current and future flood risk. And then the last one is natural, cultural, and historic resources. That includes a lot of stuff. It also includes shorelines, conservation lands, parks, archaeological sites, historic structures, data that we get from the state of Florida, their Department of Historic Resources. So we pull all that into this last category. We produce a map series that has all of these assets within it, which is a great tool for communities to have after the project is over. That way you know where all of these assets are in one place. Not everybody has that data. And we pull this data from other sources beyond just the asset data that the local government provides to us. We pull federal resources, state resources, because they maintain assets within communities as well that you may not even know are there. So this baseline asset map series has been completed, and we have provided it to the communities to evaluate and make sure that we don't have any errors and that we have all of the important things that we want to model and evaluate. So we are starting that modeling and evaluation process with the flood risk. We do what's called a sensitivity analysis, where we look at the flooding risk and what the impact is on particular assets, and we work to prioritize. So the community knows which assets are nearer term, which assets are more important to protect, and which assets are impacted more than others by this various type of flood risk. And so we have a pretty complicated system of doing that. But the important thing is we try to make that system understandable to the community by this high priority, medium priority, and low priority color coding in our map series, so you understand what's more important versus what's less important and how it will be impacted over time.
Thanks, Erin. We're
Mhm.
going to mosey right along to the exposure analysis and sensitivity analysis results. And we will start with the town of Cloud Lake this morning. These are tables representing the flood risks. This table on the left describes the precipitation in inches of certain identified storms. In this case, we're talking about a 100-year storm and a 500-year storm. And then we use the South Florida Water Management District's multiplier to project what those storms will look like in future conditions in 2050 and 2080. And then we do, as required by statute, look at sea level rise scenarios and how it affects the boundary conditions, and also surge scenarios from different storms. And in this case, we're looking at a 500-year storm and a 500-year rain event. And then we combine all the rain, the sea level rise, and the storm surge scenarios to get a maximum water rise. And that's what these maps here look like for Cloud Lake with a 500-year storm. You can see a little bit of change between this present day storm and a 2050 storm. Mostly a few increases around the lake and in between some of the homes. And again, the 28 projection here, not a big change in those. We did, as I mentioned, included a combination of storm surge and sea level rise boundary conditions. And so the legend on the right-hand side shows depth in feet. So there is potential in the future for some um, storm surge flooding in this community. And what that looks like to the critical assets for the sensitivity analysis is that it helps identify which assets are more at risk. So we consider all of the storm events. We lay those different flood depths over the assets and identify which ones are most at risk. High priorities being red, medium, orange, yellow, low, and green being a minimal risk. So I am going to hand it over to Stessie now to wrap up the couple of slides, and we'll take any questions.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. So as Georgia mentioned, my name is Stessie Coceres. I'm an analyst with Palm Beach County. My role is to assist with the coordination between the county and our municipalities on the Tetra Tech team. And before I go through the slide, I did just want to take a moment to thank you all for being here today and for your interest in the progress that we've made on the vulnerability assessments. We just talked about the results of the exposure analysis. So looking ahead, our next steps will be to include completing the sensitivity analysis, identifying the priority flood focus areas. We'll be hosting another round of public meetings to share those findings. And then ultimately we'll be finalizing the vulnerability assessment reports for each of the municipalities. Next slide, please. And of course, Palm Beach County is committed to helping our community strengthen their resilience against flooding and other natural hazards. And one of the best ways that we can do that is by listening to the residents directly. So we invite you to take a few minutes to complete our community surveys, which will help us better understand your experiences with flooding and the broader impacts of climate change. You're welcome to access these surveys using the QR codes on the slide or the URLs that are listed below them. And I think with that, we can wrap it up and open the floor for any questions.
If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat or you can raise your hand to be unmuted. Unmuted. I'm not seeing any questions, and it is exactly 10:15. So I think we will move on to the next community, which
Georgia, there's
is
a question.
okay.
The question is, Georgia,
Yes, go ahead.
there's a question from Keith. He says, I did not see anything really bad within Cloud Lake. Is that true?
Yes, that seems to be the case. There are some assets that are a little bit more vulnerable, and we'll be refining, reviewing that and refining that with Cloud Lake to make sure we've captured everything. A couple of the roads seem to be a little bit vulnerable, and there may be some opportunities to make those, identify those as needs for the community in the future. You're welcome. All right, I am going to move on to Glen Ridge and we will present for those of you that were around for Cloud Lake. Similar agenda for today, the project objectives, and then exposure and sensitivity analysis, and we'll wrap up with next steps and take your questions. So this will be Glen Ridge. And again, the project objectives, high level, we're looking to develop a cohesive strategy to identify vulnerabilities within the community and assess the flooding hazards complying with state legislation. The intent is to guide future needs and identify community partnerships, and of course, increase eligibility for state and federal grant funding. And Erin, you'd like to review your slides? Thank you.
Sure. In 2021, the state of Florida passed Resilient Florida legislation that allows local governments to access 100% funded grants to conduct vulnerability assessments. One of the important reasons why a community would conduct one of these vulnerability assessments is to be eligible for future funding for grant applications to adapt infrastructure. And all roads to those funds lead through a state compliant vulnerability assessment. So that's one of the main reasons why a community would want to conduct one. The other important reason is to know what your flood risk is and know what assets that you have that are subject to that flood risk. So, the state attaches strings to those grant dollars to make sure that the output that the communities are engaging in with these vulnerability assessments is consistent so that the state can use those outcomes in its planning as well. So they require us to look at specific flood scenarios. They require us to look at present day conditions for different types of flood risk, and also the horizon timeframes of 2050 and 2080. The statute also requires us to collect information about those assets and prioritize them based on that flood risk. And we are also communicating that to the community. We've been in one round of meetings so far. This is our second round of public meetings. So we are here today to communicate that feedback, or get that feedback from you and communicate the results that we have so far. Next slide. So these are the specific requirements that the state imposes upon our grant. We have to look at consistent elevation data with what the state is seeking from us. And that means that all communities are using the North American vertical datum as a consistent way to measure the elevations. We have to look at two different sea level rise scenarios, which may or may not impact certain communities that we are evaluating right now. In some of our communities, it's really rainfall that is the type of flood risk that we are looking at. But regardless, we have to use consistent sea level rise projections. We plan for a range of conditions, which is the intermediate low and intermediate sea level rise scenarios. And then we have to look at the 2050 and the 2080 timeframes. So we are using these requirements as guidance for conducting the vulnerability assessment. The state requires us to look at all critical assets, and the community gets to somewhat define what assets are critical, but the statute provides us guidance in terms of what we have to collect. Transportation assets include mainly roads for your communities, but it may also include some bridges and some other pieces of transportation infrastructure. Critical infrastructure is all of your linear stuff, your water, your wastewater, and then your stormwater, your pipes, your pumps. Those types of things are included within critical infrastructure. Critical community and emergency facilities may include things that are not the responsibility of the local government to maintain or adapt, but your community depends upon that infrastructure, those assets, those services. So you still want to know where they're at and how they're impacted by flood risk. And then the final category is the natural, cultural, and historic resources. That has a lot of different stuff in it, including conservation lands, parks, archaeological, historically designated buildings or homes. All of that is within that fourth category. So once we've collected the asset data, which we have, we conduct an exposure analysis, which tells us how flooding is going to impact the community over those different timeframes and scenarios. But we also conduct what's called a sensitivity analysis. And the sensitivity analysis helps us prioritize how that flood risk is going to impact assets and when. So we look at the timing of those flooding impacts. We look at the type of flooding because it may be rainfall or it may be storm surge, or what is the flooding trigger that brings attention to that particular asset. And then we look at how flooded that asset is. We boil all that down into a color coding that helps us indicate on a map series the assets under high, medium, or low priority in terms of when we need to address those impacts and how and to what extent because of the flooding impact.
All right, thanks, Erin. I will now review some of the exposure and sensitivity analysis results for the town of Glen Ridge. So the table on the left shows the 24-hour rainfall precipitation levels in inches for both a 100-year storm and a 500-year storm. And again, as Erin mentioned, required by the statute, we look at present day 2050 and 2080 projections. And on the right-hand side, we bring in the sea level rise scenarios and the storm surge scenarios to prepare a combined maximum water rise. Again, this is required by the statute. The sea level rise scenarios also include can affect the boundary conditions for the modeling that's done using GIS. So that's another reason we bring in these scenarios. And this is for a 500-year storm surge. And then again, the sea level rise projections to 2050 and 2080. So here is the Glen Ridge 500-year 24-hour storm. This is present day conditions. And through time, we see that flooding will increase, and you'll see some of these areas get a little bit more impacted by the flood risk as we move through time. And so map series includes the storm surge and the sea level rise boundary conditions. And you can see that we have little increased risk here. This is present day, increasing in 2050 and as well in 2080. So again, we take these different flood scenarios and we overlay those with the critical assets that were identified during our initial phases of data collection. And we run that sensitivity analysis that that Aaron described, and we identified the high, medium, and low priority assets. Again, for Glen Ridge, we've identified some roads that are a little bit more at risk, and on the right-hand side, you can see where that flooding is kind of concentrated. And this is the 24-hour, 500-year rainfall. So I'll turn it back over to Stessie to wrap up with our next steps.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stessie Caceres. I'm an analyst with Palm Beach County. My role is to help out with the coordination between the county and our municipalities and the Tetra Tech team. So, you just heard about our exposure analysis results, and now moving forward, we're going to be looking to complete the sensitivity analysis, identify the flood focus areas. Then we're going to be holding another public meeting to present those results, and we will then be finalizing the vulnerability assessment reports for each of the municipalities. Next slide, please. Of course, Palm Beach County is committed to helping our community strengthen the resilience against flooding and other natural hazards. So one of the best ways we can do this is to hear from the residents directly. We would like to invite you to take a few minutes and complete our community surveys. This way, it will help us better understand your experiences with flooding and the broader impacts of climate change. So you can access the surveys using the QR codes that are on this slide or the URL links that are underneath. And with that, we can wrap up this presentation and open the floor to any questions.
And for questions, you can either raise your hand to be unmuted, or you can enter your question in the chat. All right, not seeing any questions. All right, not hearing any questions, so we will stand by to kick off the next session in 1 minute. All right, good morning, everyone. Once again, this is Georgia Vince with Tetra Tech. I will be reviewing the agenda for today, noting that we are doing a round robin of discussions today. We are currently talking about the Palm Springs vulnerability assessment. We'll quickly review the project objectives, the exposure and sensitivity analysis, and then we'll wrap up with next steps and an opportunity for questions. The project objectives for the vulnerability assessment include developing a cohesive strategy and identifying the vulnerabilities to flood risk throughout the community. We assess the flooding hazards and ensure that they comply with state legislation. The intent is that the vulnerability assessment will guide future needs and identify community partnerships, as well as increase the eligibility for state and federal grant funding for the local municipalities. I'm going to turn it over to Erin to talk about the Resilient Florida statutes.
Sure. Thanks, Georgia. The Resilient Florida legislation was enacted in 2021. There have been small tweaks to it every single year since then. But one thing that the legislation did was create a pot of funding for local governments to access those dollars to conduct vulnerability assessments. Vulnerability assessments are helpful. They help you define where your critical assets are and how they might be subject to current or future flood risk under various scenarios that the state requires us to model and evaluate, which I'll talk about in a minute. The other reason that you would want to conduct a vulnerability assessment is that it provides documentation to support future grant applications to adapt those assets to the various types of flood risk that a community may want to pursue with the state of Florida. So all roads for potential funding for adaptation projects lead through a compliant vulnerability assessment. So what we do is we collect information about the assets in the community. We model and evaluate those assets based on various flood scenarios, including rainfall, storm surge, sea level rise, combined flooding. And then we look at what those impacts are presently and under the 2050 and the 2080 timeframes. We will then identify areas with high concentrations of assets where they are subject to flood risk, and we will conduct a prioritization analysis on that to help you identify what you may want to address and when. And then we communicate all of that information to the public and get feedback to make sure that we've got the right assets and we've got the right priorities. Next slide. So the Resilient Florida legislation requires us to look at consistent data across all of these vulnerability assessments conducted in the local communities. We have to use very specific elevation data. We have to look at 2 different sea level rise scenarios, which are going to be impacting communities more on the coast versus inland. And then we have to look at those 2050 and the 2080 timeframes. It's important to note that the statute requires us to look at rainfall, storm surge, sea level rise, tidal flooding, and combined flooding. Because what we have, for instance, in the town of Hypoluxo is going to be more impacted by sea level rise versus what we get in Cloud Lake or Haverhill or other communities where the flooding impacts are more related to rainfall. So we look at all of these different types of flood risk to help communities prioritize what they need to adapt and when. The asset information that we collect, we've created a map series, but it's based on all 4 of these different types of assets, which you may or may not have within your community. Just to note real quick, critical infrastructure includes your water, your wastewater, your stormwater facilities, pumps, pipes, those types of things. The critical community and emergency facilities may include things that the local community does not own and maintain or have a responsibility for adapting, like schools, hospitals, those types of things, but you need to know where they are and how they may be subject to current or future flood risk because the community depends upon them. And then the final category is the natural, cultural, and historic resources, which encompasses a lot of things, including archaeological and historic sites. Then we put all of that information into an analysis that helps us identify what assets are going to be impacted when by what type of flood risk. Then we can define what that flood risk is, the frequency of that flood risk, how deep that flood risk is, and then it helps us prioritize those assets so you know what you need to potentially adapt and when. And so we color code that with high, medium, and low priorities. And that way, when you look at the map series, you know what is the most important issue to tackle and when to tackle it.
Thanks, Erin. Now I will review the exposure analysis results and the preliminary sensitivity analysis results for the village of Palm Springs. The table on the left shows the 24-hour rainfall precipitation levels for different storm scenarios. We look at the 100-year storm and the 500-year storm. And again, we look at the present day and the 2050 and 2080 planning horizons, as Erin explained. On the right-hand side, we do need to consider sea level rise and storm surge scenarios. That's required by the statute. The sea level rise scenario often affects the boundary conditions of the model. So that's why it's important to include. For this vulnerability assessment, we looked at the 500-year storm surge. So a large storm, intense storm surge, and the 500-year rainfall event. And we take all the precipitation and the sea level rise and storm surge information and we combine that into a mean water rise in feet. And the map series for Palm Springs, I have two sets. This is the north, and again, the rainfall only scenario, the 500-year 24-hour storm. You can see based on the legend in the right-hand side that we do have some present-day flooding associated with a 500-year storm. And over time in 2050, those precipitation numbers are expected to increase. And so you see a little bit more coloration on the map as we move into the future. This is the south part of Palm Springs with some flooding here near the community college. And the 2050, seeing more intense rainfall impacts to Palm Springs. This is the combination flooding map. So present day, 100-year storm, including storm surge and again, potential sea level rise conditions, 2050 and 2080. And then for the preliminary sensitivity analysis, I focused on two areas. This would be a high priority area along Alameda Drive and Laurie Drive with the 2050 rainfall projections. You can see those on the right-hand side. And then we also pulled in, just for comparison, a lower priority area with not a lot of impacts. And you can see that on the right-hand side, the 500-year rainfall overlaid on those assets. And I will pass it to Stessie for next steps.
Hi everyone, Stessie Caceres. I'm an analyst with Palm Beach County. My main role is to help out with coordination between the county, our municipalities, and the Tetra Tech team. And so I wanted to take a second before we move forward and just thank everyone for being here today and for your interest in the progress that we've made so far on the vulnerability assessments. So you've heard the results of the exposure analysis. And looking ahead, our next steps include completing the sensitivity analysis, identifying priority flood focus areas, hosting another round of public meetings to share those findings, and then finalizing the vulnerability assessment reports for each municipality. Next slide, please. Palm Beach County is committed to helping our communities strengthen their resilience against flooding and other natural hazards. And the best way that we can do that is by listening to you, the residents, directly. So we invite you to take a few minutes to complete our community surveys, which help us better understand your experiences with flooding and the broader impacts of climate change. You can access these surveys using the QR codes on this slide or the URL links that are listed below them. And with that, we are wrapping up this presentation and can open the floor up for any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ceci. For those of you on the call, if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat, or you can raise your hand to be unmuted. And we will take any questions at this time.
Thank you for the maps. That looks 2008. It looks scary, but we'll work on it.
Yeah, we'll be preparing a full map series for each of the communities that we're working with. So you'll be able to review this in greater detail, and we can have more discussions about the best way to, prioritize potential areas, focus areas where flooding may be an issue either currently or in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. Not seeing any questions, so we'll take a few-minute break until we kick off the next community meeting. All right, good morning. My name is Georgia Vince with Tetra Tech, and today's agenda is to discuss the vulnerability assessment for the Village of Gulf. We will review the project objectives, the exposure and sensitivity analysis, review the next steps for the report, and take any questions at the end of the time. We are doing 15-minute time frames for each of the municipalities as shown on the screen on the right-hand side. So we look forward to your participation. To review the project objectives, we are looking to develop a cohesive strategy to identify vulnerabilities for each of the municipalities through a vulnerability assessment. Through that report, we assess the flooding hazards and look to comply with state legislation. The intent is that this will guide future needs and identify community partnerships and allow for increased eligibility for state and federal grant funding. I'll turn it over to Erin now to talk about the Resilient Florida program.
The Resilient Florida program was enacted in 2021, and it provides grant dollars for communities to conduct vulnerability assessments, which is what this project is, pursuant to that grant funding. It requires us to identify critical assets that are important to the community, model and evaluate the flood risk associated with current and future projections, including the 2050 and 2080 timeframes. And we look at where we have aggregations of assets and flood risk simultaneously to identify focus areas for potential identification of adaptation projects. And we are supposed to communicate all of this and receive feedback from the community, which we are in the second round of meetings to do that. Next slide. So the legislation also requires us to evaluate consistently across all local governments the various types of flood risk, including rainfall, storm surge, tidal flooding along the coast, and the combined effects of these types of flooding, both individually and cumulatively with one another. We have to use consistent elevation data. We have to look at two different sea level rise scenarios, including a low and an intermediate projection. And then we have to look at 2050 and the 2080 timeframes in addition to what the present day conditions are, so we can see what that rate of change is over the course of time. The statute requires us to evaluate certain types of assets, but within these asset categories, while we collect this information and identify where these assets are located, the communities get to identify what is the most critical of those assets. So transportation, we have to look at the roads, bridges, any other relevant transportation infrastructure resources within the area. The critical infrastructure includes both water, wastewater, stormwater, all of the kind of, non-building related infrastructure. Critical community and emergency facilities include things that the community may not own and control, like schools and hospitals and health facilities, but you still need to know where they're at and how they may be impacted over time because the community relies upon them. And then the last category is the natural, cultural, and historic resources, which also includes archaeological and historically designated properties. We've collected that asset information and created a map series, but what we are conducting right now is a sensitivity analysis to determine when those impacts for flooding may occur on those assets, what type of flooding it is. Is it rainfall? Is it storm surge? Is it sea level rise? And then what the flood depth may be. All of those indicators help us prioritize those assets into high, medium, and low priority in terms of what adaptations may be necessary and when and how important those assets are to adapt over time.
Thanks, Erin. I will now present the exposure analysis results for the Village of Gulf, along with the preliminary sensitivity analysis information. On the left-hand side, the table there represents the precipitation levels, the rainfall projections. It includes present day for a 100-year and 500-year storm, as well as the planning horizons that Aaron mentioned, 2050 and 2080, and what those rainfall changes will look like. On the right-hand side, we talk about sea level rise and storm surge scenarios. The sea level rise will affect the boundary conditions on the modeling, so that's why we include that. And then the storm surge scenarios that I'll be showing are the 500-year storm, so quite a significant storm and what the surge would look like. The maps show the combination of not only the sea level rise and the storm surge, but also the rainfall. And we combine those numbers to prepare the mean water rise in feet. And that information is overlaid on the elevation data for the community and shows where the potential impacts can occur. For the town of Gulf, this is the present day 500-year 24-hour storm. And then as we move into 2050, you can see that we're looking to have a little bit more standing water on the land, as well as with 2080. For the combined maps, this again includes the rainfall, the storm surge, and the sea level rise. And looks like we have, this is the present day 100-year rainfall event, then the 2050, and then the 2080. And as Aaron mentioned, we take all of these different flood scenarios that are required by the statute and we lay those flood scenarios over the critical assets that were identified during our data collection and analyze the sensitivity of each of those assets. So you can see that on the left-hand side is the assets prioritized with the red being the highest priority, then medium, orange, and low being yellow, with the green having minimal risk. And on the right-hand side, you can see the 500-year rainfall overlaid, one of the scenarios overlaid over those assets. So I will turn it to Stessi to talk about next steps.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Desi Caceres. I'm an analyst for Palm Beach County. My role is to assist with the coordination between the county, our municipalities, and the Tetra Tech team. I want to just take a moment before we move forward to thank everyone for being here today and for your interest in the progress that we've made on the vulnerability assessments. As George mentioned, you've just heard about the results of the exposure analysis, and looking ahead, our next steps will include completing the sensitivity analysis, identifying priority flood focus areas, hosting another round of public meetings to share those findings, and finalizing the vulnerability assessment reports for each of the municipalities. Next slide, please. So our county is committed to helping the communities strengthen the resilience against flooding and other natural hazards. One of the best ways that we can do that is by listening to residents directly. So we invite you to take a few minutes to complete our community surveys to help us better understand your experiences with flooding and the broader impacts of climate change. Of course, you can access those surveys with the QR codes that are on the screen or through the URL links that are listed underneath them. And with that, we will wrap up this municipality presentation and open the floor up for any questions. Thank you.
So I see a question in the chat from Christine asking about the Lake Worth Drainage District canals. And if our scenarios predict those canals overflowing their banks and flooding the village. So the flooding scenarios are simply the water depth over the elevation of the land. We don't look to predict the efficiency or lack of efficiency for the drainage district. And so that is maybe one of the weaknesses of this type of vulnerability assessment. It is simply a GIS analysis. I do know that the Lake Worth Drainage District is currently performing a similar analysis, and so they are doing some detailed hydrologic modeling that will be available to the public as well. The next question I see in the chat is about the vulnerability assessments. And the vulnerability assessments are in process. Um, and so we will present the sensitivity analysis results kind of separate from the full report. And then we will provide the vulnerability assessment in a few months down the road later this year. The rainfall predictions are based on the Atlas 14 data. It's a federally approved data source. And then the projections we use are from the South Florida Water Management District change projections in their future conditions analysis. Hopefully that answers those three very good questions. Thank you for that. All right, seeing no more questions, we'll take a short break and resume our sessions in 3 minutes. Good morning, everyone. My name is Georgia Vince. I'm with Tetra Tech, and I'm the project manager for the multi-jurisdictional vulnerability assessment that we're discussing today. On our agenda at this point, we're going to be talking about the town of Haverhill. We will discuss the project objectives, the exposure and sensitivity analysis that will be incorporated into the vulnerability assessment, and then we'll discuss next steps and take any questions at the end of our presentation. The project objectives include developing a cohesive strategy to identify vulnerabilities associated with flood risk. We assess those flooding hazards in accordance with the state legislation called the Resilient Florida Program. And we will guide future needs of the community and identify partnerships where we can strategize to implement projects. And then lastly, we look to increase the eligibility for state and federal grant funding. I will turn it over to Erin to talk a little bit more about the Resilient Florida legislation.
The Resilient Florida legislation and program was enacted in 2021. It requires certain elements for local governments that access grant funds to conduct vulnerability assessments. First, we have to collect information and identify all of the individual community's critical assets. I'll talk about what those are in a slide or two. We have to then conduct various flood scenarios that are required by statute. Again, we look at current conditions and the timeframes of 2050 and 2080. We then prioritize those assets so the community knows what to tackle in terms of adaptation for flood risk and when. We look at areas where we have that elevated risk of flooding and the assets together so that we can define focus areas, knowing where we have to kind of zoom in and do more work in terms of adaptation to alleviate the risk to assets. And then we communicate the information about the vulnerability assessment to the public and get feedback. Next slide. So Section 380.093 enacted in 2021 requires consistent output with these vulnerability assessments across all the various local governments. We have to use the same elevation data. We have to use the same sea level rise scenarios. So we plan for a range of conditions, including intermediate low and intermediate sea level rise projections, and then we're required to look at both the 2050 and the 2080 timeframes. It's important to note this is a diverse group of municipalities, and different types of flood risk are going to impact differently the communities or not at all. For instance, further inland, sea level rise and tidal flooding isn't going to be an issue, but rainfall is going to be the biggest concern. And the types of rainfall events that we're seeing where they're different times of the year, higher volume, and higher duration of those rainfall events are going to affect communities differently inland versus the coast. So we look at all of these different types of flood risk and the combined nature about how that flood risk may exacerbate one another and the impact on the community. Next slide. The statute prescribes 4 different types of assets, but once we've collected all of that asset information, we focus on the ones that are really critical. For instance, with transportation facilities, it could include stop signs and sidewalks and that type of thing, but those are not the most critical things for the community to focus on in terms of its adaptation efforts. It's going to be the roads, the bridges, those types of things that you need to get around in the community. Critical infrastructure includes water, wastewater, stormwater, all of your utilities and your non-building related infrastructure. Critical community and emergency facilities includes those buildings and the things that the community relies upon that the community may not own and maintain, like hospitals, schools, those types of things, but you still rely upon them. And you rely upon them to be free from flood risk or lessen flood risk. The last one is the natural, cultural, and historic resources, which include shorelines, parks, conservation areas, archaeological, historic sites, those types of things. Then we conduct a sensitivity analysis, which requires us to look at the actual flood risk on the individual assets. We look at the timing of that risk, the type of flooding that is impacting that asset, and the average depth of that flooding. That helps us identify the high, medium, and low priorities of when we need to potentially do something with those assets to alleviate that flood risk. And so the sensitivity analysis helps us understand what's the most important and what's the nearest term to potentially look at adaptation strategies.
Thanks, Erin. I will now review the exposure analysis results and also discuss the preliminary sensitivity analysis results that we have for the town of Haverhill. On the left-hand side, this table represents the different precipitation, the rainfall events that we analyze for the vulnerability assessment. It includes the present day 100-year and 500-year storms. And then again, as Erin mentioned, a projection into the future to 2050 and 2080 using the South Florida Water Management District multipliers that they've identified. On the right-hand side, we include the sea level rise scenarios and the storm surge scenarios. The sea level rise can affect the boundary conditions for the modeling, so that's why we include that. And then for the storm surge, we'll be showing the 500-year, which is a pretty intense storm. For the combination maps, we put all of the different flood scenarios together for a combined mean water rise, and we report that back in feet on the right-hand side. So this is Haverhill, the 100-year, 24-hour rain event. This is the present day on the left-hand side. And then looking forward into 2050, you do see a little bit of change here, and I'm going to focus on these roadways here. You'll see in the sensitivity analysis how that increase in flooding affects that particular area. And some of these roads here in the north west corner of the town. Oops. This is the sensitivity analysis. It shows again this area of roads here on the left, and with the rainfall, 500-year rainfall on the right-hand side, showing that these roads are susceptible and vulnerable to flood risk. And again, these roads here on the northwest side of town can also be at risk. This big polygon here is actually a park that shows some flood risk, but it's a low area of the town. And so that's what our preliminary sensitivity analysis looks like, with, again, the high being red, medium being orange, and low being yellow. So Stacey, I'll turn it over to you to talk about our next steps.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stacey Caceres. I'm an analyst with Palm Beach County. My role is mainly to assist with coordination between the county, our municipalities, and the Tetra Tech team. Before I go through this slide, I just want to take a moment to thank everyone that came here today to listen and to show interest in the progress that we've made on the vulnerability assessments. So you heard about the exposure analysis results. And looking ahead, our next steps will include completing the sensitivity analysis, identifying priority flood focus areas, hosting another round of public meetings to share the findings, and ultimately finalizing the vulnerability assessment reports for each municipality. Next slide, please. The county is committed to helping our communities strengthen their resilience against flooding and other natural hazards. And one of the best ways that we can do that is by listening to you, the residents, directly. We invite you to take a few minutes to complete our community service surveys, which will help us better understand your experiences with flooding and the broader impacts of climate change. And you can access them using the QR codes that are on this slide or the URL links that are below. And with that, we can wrap up this municipality presentation and open the floor for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat or you can unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, this is Jay Foy, Town of Haverhill, Mayor. You said the rainfall was determined in the future by South Florida Water Management District multipliers. Is there a
Yes.
particular study or something I can look up to see how they got those?
Jay,
Yeah.
this is Erin. There actually is a study. The Water Management District contracted with USGS a couple of years back to develop future rainfall conditions for the entirety of the district. And so there's a published study where they have change factors and multipliers that we utilize for the future rainfall projections.
I wasn't doubting that. I just wanted to know what the reference is so I can look at it.
I'll email it to you.
Sounds good. And, you know, current criteria requires us the house is not supposed to flood from the 100-year storm. The roads and lots are. So do you think this is going to lead to revisions in codes, ordinances, rules to require us to build roads and houses higher? Where are we going with this?
So I'm going to be the one that's doing the policy recommendations that come out of the vulnerability assessment. I mean, obviously, we have to be consistent with Florida Building Code, with FEMA, with the new firms, all of that other stuff. So, you know, we've got some challenging provisions out there in Senate Bill 180 for local governments already in terms of restrictive or burdensome regulations. So I'm mindful of that as well. I don't know where these recommendations are going to lead right now, but we understand what the Florida Building Code process is. For instance, if you wanted to increase freeboard, you would have to go through the local technical amendment process to the Florida Building Code. So we're not going to be making recommendations that the local community can't actually implement, if that makes sense.
But just as a follow-up comment, not that I'm not questioning what you're saying. If you raise the roads, you push the water somewhere else. If you raise the house, that causes the house and the surrounding fill to be higher. So there's cause and effect. Whatever we end up doing,
Absolutely.
some existing communities could suffer.
Absolutely. And you may not even have the right of way available to potentially elevate roads. So in that type of instance, like we're doing a lot of work down in the Keys on this issue where we've got constraints, but the point is that you do the best you can and you may end up in, you know, we're going to continue to maintain that road, but we may not actually be able to elevate it. So we understand the constraints that you're talking about with existing communities.
Just one other comment. I do appreciate that you said right up front that the coastal areas don't really, you know, the elevation difference between the S155 structure which is controlled by seawater, and us, that's an elevation 8. Our town is somewhere, and I talk NGVD, sorry, I'm old school. It's somewhere around 16 to 19, and our finished floors are up to 20 or above. So we will not typically, as your results showed, we won't typically be affected by any sea level rise back where we're at.
Yeah, completely understood.
That's all I got. Let's pass it on to somebody else.
Thanks, Jay.
Been a long time, Aaron.
Not that long. You make me feel old.
I am old.
It took me a second, but I did find the link to the projections and I'll put that in the chat. All right, I think we need to move on to the next presentation. And so, hello everyone, this is Georgia Vince with Tetra Tech. Today's agenda, we'll be talking about specifically the town of Hypoluxo. For the vulnerability assessment, we will identify the project objectives, review the exposure and sensitivity analysis, and discuss next steps. For the project objectives, we really are looking to develop a cohesive strategy and identify vulnerabilities through the assessment. We will be assessing the flood hazards and ensuring compliance with state legislation. The intent is that this vulnerability assessment will guide future needs and identify community partnership opportunities, as well as identify increase the eligibility for state and federal grant funding opportunities. I'm going to turn it over to Erin to talk through the Resilient Florida program for the vulnerability assessment.
The Resilient Florida program was enacted in 2021, and it provides funds, 100% grant funds for local governments to conduct vulnerability assessments. But of course, when you have a grant, there are strings attached and they want you to model and evaluate certain things in a certain way. We have to develop certain types of flood risk analysis. We have to include current conditions 2050 and 2080. And we also prioritize assets for people to understand the implications of what's going to be impacted when, so they can respond to that type of flood risk. Where we have areas of high concentrations of assets and flooding simultaneously, those translate into focus areas. And we are communicating all of this to the public to get feedback. The Resilient Florida statute requires us to look at certain types of elevation data, sea level rise scenarios of intermediate low and intermediate, and 2 planning horizons in the 2050-2080 timeframe. We have to look at multiple types of flood risk because it may impact the communities differently. For instance, sea level rise is going to be impact along those coastal communities, but not so much for the inland communities where we may be looking at storm surge or rainfall driven impacts. We also have to look at the combined effects of these different types of flood scenarios together, because when they occur simultaneously, they may exacerbate one another and the impacts upon the community. The statute requires us to look at different types of critical assets. These are the 4 types of assets listed. Just to clarify, for critical infrastructure, that includes your water, wastewater, stormwater facilities. Critical community and emergency facilities may include assets that the community doesn't actually own or maintain, but you rely upon them. So you still want to know how they're going to be impacted by flood risk over time and into the future. And then we look at the natural, cultural, historic resources, which includes historically designated properties and or archaeological sites. Finally, we pull all of that asset information together and we evaluate it with our flood scenarios to determine the timing of the flooding impact, the type of flooding impact and its frequency, and then the flood depths that we may be looking at over time and projected into the future. The output of that sensitivity analysis is to prioritize the assets as either high, medium, or low, and that helps us determine what assets we may need to adapt to over time and when we may need to do it.
So I'll next discuss the exposure analysis results of the flooding analysis, and then we'll discuss the preliminary results of the sensitivity analysis. On the left-hand side is the rainfall projection levels. It includes the present day 100 and 500-year storm, as well as looking into the future, the 2050 and 2080 scenarios that Aaron mentioned were part of the Resilient Florida Statute. On the right-hand side, we include sea level rise and storm surge scenarios, which looks at the present day, the 2050 and the 2080, as well as the 500-year storm surge and the 500-year 24-hour rain event. We combine all those to get an average mean water rise in feet, and you can see based on this table at the bottom right that it's 13 feet is the max combined mean water rise for this community. And you'll see that reflected in the flood maps. This is the 500-year 24-hour rainfall event, present day, and then looking into the future at 2050, and then further into 2080. And you can see how things are increasing, water depths are increasing in some of the more eastern portions of the town. This is NOAA intermediate sea level rise and high tide footing maps for present day, 2050, and 2080. And then we do have storm surge maps associated with for the town of Hypoluxo. But for this map series, this is the preliminary sensitivity analysis results. On the left-hand side, you can see some of the roads are being identified as a high priority and a higher risk. The 500-year rainfall event is in the center. You can see some of the increase in water depths in that map. And then on the right-hand side, that shows the present day 500-year storm surge. So with that, I will turn it over to Stessie to wrap up the presentation for the town of Hypoluxo.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stessie Coceres. I'm an analyst with Palm Beach County. My role is to assist with the coordination between the county, our municipalities, and the Tetra Tech team. Before we move on forward with this slide, I just wanted to take a moment and thank everyone for being here today and for your interest in the progress that we've made so far on the vulnerability assessments. So as Georgia mentioned, you heard the results of the exposure analysis, and looking ahead, our next steps will be to complete the sensitivity analysis, identify priority flood focus areas, host another round of public meetings to present those results, and finalize the vulnerability assessment reports for each municipality. Next slide, please. Okay, Palm Beach County is committed to helping our communities strengthen their resilience against flooding and other natural hazards. And one of the best ways that we can think to do that is to hear directly from our residents. So we would like to invite you to take a few minutes to complete our community surveys, which will help us better understand your experiences with flooding and the broader impacts of climate change. You can access those surveys using the QR codes that are on this slide or the URL links that are listed below them. And with that, we will wrap up our presentation and open the floor for any questions. Thank you so much.